To the House Judiciary Committee room. We have we have some guests from Dartmouth who are going to be presenting related to their research related to recruitment and retention of rural lawyers. We also have a couple of guest senators who are sitting in on this important research. Thank you very much, senators, for being here. But we'll go around. We'll just introduce ourselves real quick, and if you could introduce yourselves. Martin Malone, I'm a rep from South Burlington. This is the 12th year in the House, and I chair this committee.
Hi, my name is Barbara Rachelson. I'm a state rep from Burlington. I have my master's degree in policy from Social Work School, University of Michigan, and this is my 14th year as a legislator and my 12th year on this committee. Yeah.
Kenny Golstein, I'm from Northfield and Berlin. I represent Northfield and Berlin, state rep. Been in this committee for 8 years, trying to understand lawyers. So I'm sure you're about to teach me more.
Karen Dolan, I'm representative from Essex Junction, and thanks for being here. Looking forward to this.
Good morning, Senator Bob, North Franklin County and the town of Elburg in Grand Isle County. I've been in the Senate now for 4 years. I started my illustrious career here with Chair Lalonde and Rep. Rachelson and Golstein. And it's good to be back briefly.
Senator Russ Ingles, I represent the Essex District, which is the Northeast Kingdom, 25 towns. Been in the Senate for 6 years, and I chair Senate Agriculture.
Turn it over to you then.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for your time. It's great to be here. I'm Ben Perry. I'm studying sophomore at Dartmouth. I'm studying government and minoring in public policy. I'm from Windham County. I'm from Westminster, Vermont. So it's great to be here.
Morning. My name is Noah Pilnitz. I'm also a sophomore at Dartmouth studying government and geography, and I'm originally from Tehran. And just before we start, I'm going to explain the packages in front of you. So you open up the package. On the left, we have a contact sheet for Ben and I, and then also our supervising professors, as well as our actual published brief. And then on the right, we have two tables, two handouts that we'll do. All right, so good morning, everyone. As I said, my name is Noah, and this is my colleague, Ben. We're from the Policy Research Shop at the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center for Public Policy at Dartmouth. The Policy Research Shop conducts nonpartisan, non-advocacy research for policymakers in Vermont and New Hampshire. And today we're going to be presenting research on rural lawyers in Vermont. All right, just a quick overview of our presentation. So we'll be first defining our problem and our research questions before moving on to our methodology, Vermont's current policy landscape, our case studies and findings, as well as potential policy pathways for Vermont. All right, our problem statement. So across the United States, many rural communities face stagnant growth and population loss. And because of these factors, new attorneys tend to establish practices in urban areas. So that's, for more clients or also higher incomes. And as rural attorneys retire, there's a decrease in attorneys serving rural areas. And since there's not enough new attorneys coming in over time, this trend creates a shortage of attorneys in rural areas, or what is called a rural legal desert. And so what is a legal desert? So in 2020, the American Bar Association, or the ABA, released a report talking about legal deserts all over the country. In that report, they defined a rural legal desert as a county with less than one lawyer per 1,000 residents. And they also used state bar registries to calculate that. On average in the United States, there are about 4 lawyers per 1,000. They also calculated that for Vermont, that number was around 5.8. So by this metric, Vermont actually exceeds the national average, and it's far above the 1 lawyer per 1,000 threshold for rural legal deserts. However, this number doesn't tell the full story for several reasons. So the first is the geographic disparity. The majority of lawyers in Vermont are concentrated in Burlington and Montpelier, and many rural areas, for example, like in the Northeast Kingdom, have much lower rates of lawyers. Actually, the rate in Essex County, I recall, is 0.8 lawyers per 1,000 residents. So that's actually below the American Bar Association's threshold. Second,
State questions. I'll wait to see it.
at the end.
Okay. I just, I'm curious.
Most lawyers also specialize in certain areas, so there can be a mismatch between what lawyers specialize in and what the community needs. And in particular, we found that there's a shortage in a lot of less lucrative fields and positions. So, for example, there's a great need for legal aid lawyers. And most importantly, Vermont's population is aging very quickly, particularly in the legal professions. And so in 2024, the median attorney age in Vermont was 56 years. And actually, since 2015, Vermont has lost nearly 10% of its attorneys. And this is a trend that's only going to accelerate as the profession continues to age. Some of the consequences of a lawyer shortage. So the first one is reduced judicial efficiency. When there's a shortage of lawyers, there's an increase in the number of self-represented litigants. And oftentimes, self-represented litigants might not know the complex procedures around things like paperwork. And so judges often have to spend time explaining these procedures to self-represented litigants as opposed to ruling on cases. So that causes delays. Second, increased administrative costs. So the state is obligated to provide attorneys to criminal defendants who cannot afford a lawyer. And if they can't, in rural areas, if they can't find local attorneys to do that, then they have to contract attorneys from further away, pay them for their time and mileage, and that increases administrative costs. Third, delays for trial. And the Sixth Amendment and the Speedy Trial Act guarantees defendants a right to a quick trial. But if the state cannot find lawyers to represent these criminal defendants that cannot afford lawyers, then that also delays their trials as well and jeopardizes their rights there. And then lastly, lawyers, by virtue of their education, tend to be very active citizens. They're often very involved in volunteering and advocating for their communities. It's no coincidence that many people in the legislature are lawyers by profession. And so we think that rural communities really do benefit from lawyers beyond their provision of legal services. All right, so moving on to the current scholarship on this issue, there has been past research done on this topic, both on the national level as well as in Vermont. And so first in the column all the way down on the right, we see on the left, in 2024, the Legal Services Corporation, which is a nonprofit founded by Congress, produced a report detailing national rural legal needs. And what they found was that across the United States, there was a broad shortage of attorneys in rural areas. They also found that in rural areas, a lot of the times there was a lack of access to digital technology and internet speeds, as well as large distances with inadequate transportation. And those factors made it very difficult for rural residents to seek legal help. And they also found that rural residents strongly preferred local rural lawyers because they trusted them more and also because they felt that those lawyers were more sensitive to their needs. In 2024, Legal Services Vermont and Vermont Legal Aid released a statewide legal needs report. And in that report, they found that there were significant gaps in access to justice for most areas of civil law. They also found that rural residents actually request in-person services at a much higher rate. And part of that reason might be because of the rural technology infrastructure gap. So that's in things like Wi-Fi speed and technology, but also in terms of familiarity and comfort with online platforms. Now, in response to that report, the Vermont Supreme Court established a commission on the delivery of legal services. And as part of that commission, they also commissioned a report just looking at brief approaches and solutions. And some of the things that came out of that was provisional licensing for lawyers, conducting more outreach to more vulnerable populations like rural populations, supporting existing recruitment programs, and then also establishing incentives for rural attorneys. And so that brings us to our research. So we categorize the existing approaches to this issue into 4 broad approaches. So that's what you can see on the second level. We have recruiting lawyers, retaining lawyers, providing non-lawyer alternatives, such as expanding the role of paralegals, as well as making existing lawyers more efficient by promoting digital options. And in this presentation, we're going to focus specifically on the recruitment approach. And we divided that into 3 different pathways of undergraduate mentorship, professional development, as well as providing financial incentives.
So moving into our research questions, I should say, these are the 3 guiding questions that shaped much of our brief and the presentation you see before you. First off, what is the current policy landscape in Vermont? What are we doing now to address the issue? The second is, what are other states doing to improve recruitment of lawyers in rural lawyers in rural areas? And finally, how could Vermont implement similar policies? With that in mind, we're going to move away from defining the problem, the research question, and into our methods. So first, as you heard a brief bit about, we did an extensive literature review. This includes the LSC, the VBA report, for the Vermont Supreme Court's Commission report, et cetera, as well as scholarship that exists throughout the nation by attorneys or program leaders, as you'll see later. Second, we conducted qualitative interviews. This began as smaller interviews with local attorneys to really contextualize the issue. And that expanded to expert level interviews with people running programs or people who are really in depth with the legal landscapes of Vermont and other states. Finally, as you'll see much more frequently in the rest of this presentation, we conducted case studies. We examined 3 state programs, which each target different stage of the lawyer pipeline. That's what you saw in the recruitment, either financial incentives, undergraduate help, or professional development. So using those 3 case study states, we wanted states that A, have a similar critical lack of rural attorneys. We don't want states that are very well off. It'd be great if they were very well off, but we want states that have a similar problem to us. We want states with the existence and success of rural law programs. And notably, we want states with similar levels of rurality and population dynamics to Vermont. That can be a rural-urban divide, that could be decreasing population, median age increase, et cetera. This led us to our 3 case study states that weren't Vermont, which is South Dakota, Nebraska, and Maine, each offering their own programs that we'll examine throughout the rest of this brief presentation. So moving from methodology, again, to Vermont's current policy landscape, what are we doing now to address the issue? So first, as many I'm sure are familiar with the Law Office Study Program, this is a 4-year apprenticeship under a licensed Vermont attorney or judge, where a prospective lawyer is able to read the law for 4 years, and if they're able to prove that they have learned their full capabilities of law, they can take the bar and hopefully be licensed in the state of Vermont. Alternatively, it exists the Vermont Bar Association and Vermont Law Graduate School Incubator Program. This is an 18-month support program for new attorneys serving underserved populations. This is less of a focus on our brief, but it is a program that exists. There's the Vermont Bar Association Loan Repayment Program. This is similar to other programs we'll see later in this presentation, but it's a loan assistance for public interest lawyers with a rural priority. And finally, there currently exists a UVM plus Vermont Law Graduate School 3+3 accelerated degree, which is a program that allows students to earn both a bachelor's degree and a JD in 6 years of study, as opposed to the typical 7-year pathway. Knowing that, we're moving to case studies and findings, and this really gets at the heart of our second question, which is, what are other states doing to improve recruitment of lawyers in rural areas?
So our first case study is South Dakota's Rural Attorney Recruitment Program, and this is a type of financial incentive program. And how it works is it provides attorneys who move and set up practice in rural counties with an annual stipend of around $12,500 for the first 5 years that they open practice. This applicants generally get matched to certain counties depending on the needs of certain counties, as well as whether or not they have local ties to the area. This program was established in 2013, which makes it one of the oldest rural attorney recruitment programs in the country. And the program was initially started through the state bar, creating a coalition of rural legal advocates back in 2011. So the president of the state bar at the time, his law partner, who was a legislator, many private practitioners, as well as the dean of the University of South Dakota's law school. And how the funding works for the stipend is as below. So 50% of the funding comes directly from the state through the judiciary, 35% is paid by the host county, and then the remaining 15% is paid by the state bar. As for the results, so since 2013, the program has had 36 total participants. 6 of them dropped out before the 5 years were finished, but out of the 30 that actually successfully completed, we have 19 who have completed the program and 11 participants who are currently receiving stipends, so they're currently within their first 5 years. Out of the 19 that have completed the program and have taken all 5 stipends, 14 of them actually remain in their rural community even after the stipend stopped. And one other finding from this case study was that actually lawyers provided a lot more indirect benefits to their county, more so than just the provision of legal services. And so, for example, a lot of attorneys provided pro bono work, both for individuals in the community, as well as serving on boards and advising their local government. A lot of them also bought property. They paid property taxes, opened up second businesses, paid taxes on that. And so they really did also stimulate the local economy. And so we found that the net cost to a county for actually hosting one of these lawyers was much less than their share because of all these indirect financial benefits as well. Next, moving on to Nebraska's Rural Law Opportunity Program. This is a program under our undergraduate mentorship pathway. And so what this is an undergraduate enrichment program targeted at rural pre-law students. It's hosted at 4 state colleges. And as you'll see on the map here, these state colleges are Chadron, Wayne, Nebraska Kearney, and Peru. And so what you'll notice is that all these colleges are actually in rural areas away from the main urban centers of Omaha and Lincoln. And they're actually geographically dispersed across the state. And so what this scholarship entails is a full tuition scholarship for all 4 years of undergraduate education, as well as additional enrichment opportunities like internship placements, LSAT preparation, and then mentorship from lawyers, as well as field trips both within the state and out of the state. And then at the end of their 4 years, they have a provisional acceptance to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's College of Law, provided they meet a certain LSAT minimum. So that takes away the uncertainty of post undergraduate plans. And this program was actually modeled after an existing Nebraska program targeted at rural students interested in healthcare and medicine. And so that program has been running for several decades, since the 80s, and it was widely known as very successful within the state. And then they adapted it for law students as well. And in this program, each school is responsible for funding their own tuition scholarship and expenses. Now, results. So this program first started accepting students in 2016, but it was only very recently that they expanded the program. And this is data from just one of the 4 participating colleges. This is from University of Nebraska Kearney. And currently, out of the people who have finished this program, we have 18 current students that are going through law school, 8 of whom have eight students that have already graduated law school. And then out of those 8 students, 5 of them actually ended up returning to their rural areas and opening up practice.
So moving into Maine, this is the Rural Practice Clinic. This is a clinic that is funneling into the professional development side. This is post-undergrad, but while still in law school. It's a 1-semester placement for University of Maine law school students in Fort Kent, Maine. You may not know where that is. I didn't know where it was before doing research. That's all the way at the north tip of Maine. It's far away from everywhere else, every other population center. So this is deep rural Maine. Students provide pro bono services to the underserved rural community. Namely, this is under the supervision of local Aroostook County attorneys and UMaine professors. And there's other opportunities such as additional community outreach, like pairing a particular townsperson with a lawyer for the day to give legal advice, and ways of allowing them to further integrate with the community. In regards to funding, this has cost University of Maine $640,000 over 2 years. But in particular, that's funded through the Office of the Attorney General's Antitrust Settlement Fund. That was set aside for that entire 2-year block, and they're currently in the process of trying to make that a line item budget in their state budget. In regards to attorney demographics for Maine, this is what was particularly interesting to us. 50% of all Maine attorneys are based in a single county, which is Cumberland County, notably Portland's there. So that mirrors a lot of what we see in Vermont, where you have those really distinct population centers. 50% of all their lawyers are in Portland, basically, is what we're trying to get at. So with that in mind, these are some more results behind the Rural Practice Clinic. A big concern when it comes to trying to reach law students and try to get them back into communities is, are these people going to stay, and are they going to buy in to the culture of rural areas? And a way that this was comforting in a way is that the Rural Practice Clinic, professors and people in the community noted the ease at which that students adjusted well to rural life. They're joining church groups, running clubs, book clubs, things like that. They're engaging with the rural communities. And the hope is that this will keep them coming back and growing more ties in the state rather than just doing the program while they're there. Looking to the future, as I said, UMaine is looking to expand in the coming years following approved funding. This is hopefully, like I said, becoming a line item in the state budget as opposed to simply through the Attorney General's office and that antitrust funding. Results in those 3 years it's been operating. This has been 20 student participants. Again, these are participants in rural Maine, so the numbers are relatively low per cohort, but over 168 cases have been opened as of October 2025. These span all areas of law, but notably family and civil law. And the program is full through fall 2026. So at least at UMaine, there's a demonstrated enthusiasm for this program. Students want to participate. So we're going to move away from case studies and findings. And with that in mind, we want to ask the question, how could Vermont influence similar policies? What are the policy pathways?
And before we discuss our specific pathways, we're going to go over some key stakeholders that we feel are important to engage in helping address the issues. So the first one is the legislature, because of course the legislature is the one that's often funding programs, but also they're in a really good position to help build coalitions of these stakeholders that have made these things possible. So as you'll remember, in South Dakota, there was a coalition with the state bar, people in higher education, as well as legislators that really advocated and pushed for this thing to be funded. Next is judiciary. It's the judiciary that shoulders most of the costs and negative impacts of rural legal shortages, like for example, like finding other counsel and also like having delayed trials and things like that. So they're naturally a very interested party. And they also have administrative experience. So for example, in South Dakota, it was the judiciary that was doing the matching between the applicants and the host counties that wanted lawyers. Next, the state bar. So naturally the state bar, it's a group of lawyers, it's a group of all rural lawyers. And so they have a very strong interest in this issue. In South Dakota, the state bar was the one that first established a rural advocacy group, as well as also in Nebraska, the state bar also established a rural practice group as well. And also there are lots of potential for mentorship within the state bar, and it's a good place to coordinate that. Next, higher education institutions. So of course, for the undergraduate and professional development, they have a really big role. But more generally, higher education institutions are really good places to do outreach to find those students who maybe have roots in rural Vermont and are thinking of going into law, but are just not quite sure and would benefit from additional outreach. And lastly, current rural practitioners. And so there are a lot of rural practitioners who are close to retirement. And what we found was that a lot of them were actually looking to do retirement planning for their practices. But because there are not enough young attorneys moving in, they're having trouble passing on their practice. So that's a really big area, very low hanging fruit, because it's much easier to pass on a practice than it is to have a practice closed down, have all the clients leave, have the building rented out, and then a few years later, having a new lawyer come in and opening up shop. That's much harder. All right. So the first pathway is financial incentives, and we'll give you three factors to consider. So the first is the type of incentive. So as we mentioned before, the Vermont Bar actually has a sort of student loan forgiveness program for people who are interested in rural law. And in general, student loan forgiveness is a very common incentive that many states use for all sorts of things. In South Dakota, however, they actually had a direct stipend instead of student loan forgiveness, and that has a few key advantages. So, for example, people that go through less expensive forms of education, legal education. So, for example, if they, had scholarships through law school, or for example, if they didn't go through law school but went through the law office study program and then didn't pay tuition, they wouldn't benefit as much from a student loan forgiveness program. Also, if you're an older attorney that's more established in practice that has already paid off your student loans, you wouldn't be benefiting from this program either. And then also having a direct stipend provides flexibility for attorneys. So for example, attorneys have the option maybe to spend that stipend on startup costs, like establishing an office, buying supplies, paying rent, and that might be more helpful than paying out the student loans in that moment. And then there are also types of incentives with a lower upfront cost than paying them stipend. So for example, one thing that is possible is to give property tax credits, and that's a way of incentivizing attorneys without having to pay that upfront cost, which can be difficult for municipalities. Next is the funding arrangement. So in South Dakota, it was 50% through the state, 35% through the host county, and then 15% through the state bar. South Dakota has many more counties than Vermont, so an analogous jurisdiction for that in Vermont might be like the municipality, like towns. And that also gives flexibility because if an attorney is in a particular town, it's very likely that they'll also serve populations in the surrounding towns. And so there could be agreements made with regional groupings of towns to all pitch in and fund the cost for that attorney. State grants might also help offset some of those municipality costs. And then lastly, we'd also have to think about the stipend amount, and that might be needed to be adjusted for local costs of living. And next is the duration of the incentive. So in South Dakota, it was 5 years of stipends. And as you recall, it was 14 out of 19 lawyers. So that's a rather high retention rate of attorneys because they, by the time the 5 years elapsed, they had established themselves in their community. Another possibility is to also encourage participants to establish ties in their local community. So for example, offering real estate incentives, or for example, things like health insurance or family type incentives so that they feel more established and are more comfortable in their community. Next, the undergraduate mentorship pathways. And here we have 4 things to consider. So the first is outreach. Again, providing outreach to rural Vermont high school students, as well as undergraduates at UVM or Vermont State Colleges, because there are people that might just not know about the opportunities available, benefit from knowing in outreach. A scholarship program, so similar to Nebraska's Rural Law Opportunities Program, that could include elements like a full tuition scholarship, mentorship opportunities, help with the LSAT, and also internships in local rural practitioners in Vermont. Vermont already has a 3+3 UVM VLGS program, and it's one of the possibilities is to modify that program to include a more rural focused track so that students that are from rural areas and have an interest in practicing rural law can benefit from that too. And then lastly, professional support. So as they graduate their undergraduate degree and go on to law school, providing them with resources like internships with local attorneys and courts can also help them as well. Now, just an estimated cost for this pathway. So assuming a scholarship program like in Nebraska where there's full tuition scholarship for their entire duration of their undergraduate education. So in the 3+3 program, that would come out to around $215,000 worth of tuition per student for 6 years. And if we assume like a 20 student cohort, that would be around $4.3 million a year of subsidized tuition. But a lot of that cost has already been subsidized and offset by existing forms of financial aid. So we have federal Pell Grants for low-income students, Vermont state grants, and then as well as institutional and private scholarships that UVM already has.
So our final pathway that we identified in the brief is professional development. This mirrors a lot of what they do in Maine, as we said. So first, this could look like it's Vermont's own rural legal clinic. This could be built based on existing infrastructure. We could partner with Vermont Legal Aid or alongside Vermont Law Graduate School to provide a similar rural clinic for underserved populations. Think Essex County, think Caledonia County. This could alternatively look like targeted internships for students studying in Vermont or out of state as a means to encourage students to stay in state. If you incentivize them through internships of staying home, the thought there is that they will want to stay home if they're being provided those resources. That's another one of those big concerns that comes up is with Vermont only having the one law school and UVM being in a particular part of the state, many students who study out of state may lose fears that they lose touch with those roots. And if we provide targeted internships, the hope is we can encourage them to stay in state. Third, this could look like some sort of formal succession pipeline as a means of matching promising law students or recent law school graduates with rural attorneys who are looking to retire their practices. Namely, like I said, we can match new attorneys to retiring practitioners, aiming to preserve goodwill and mentorship within the communities. As we stated, it's much easier to succeed from lawyer to new lawyer than it is to totally see an office collapse. And if we provide matching, the hope there is that you can get people who are passionate, who will actually contribute in the same way that lawyer once did. Finally, we could expand on existing law office study programs. This could be as simple as expanding awareness, but we could also think of it as recruiting more apprenticeship candidates, increasing the number of people we see. Currently, there's roughly 45 to 50 active people participating in that program. If we even up the numbers on that, that's one of the more low-cost options compared to establishing an entire play. Notably, as we said, those who study in the law study program are only licensed to practice law in Vermont. And in the time that it takes for them to study and eventually become licensed, the idea is they grow roots and establish themselves in the community and have built those ties to Vermont. The hope is that they will stay in state because of that. Finally, the license would not be portable to most states, as we said, in the lawful study program. So through expanding that, we could hope that more people are building ties through their studying.
All right, and just some final conclusions to wrap up our presentation. So the first one is that Vermont's lawyer shortage will accelerate as the state ages. Number two, we covered 3 pathways for recruitment in this presentation: financial incentives, undergraduate mentorship, and professional development. And all of these target different stages of the lawyer education process. Number 3, the legislature can build a diverse coalition of stakeholders, which can include institutions like the state bar, judiciary, educational institutions, as well as current rural practitioners. And then lastly, because a legal education often takes a very long time, programs might require years of sustained investment and monitoring before you start to see the first graduates come out. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your time.
And I'll be taking questions.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Barbara.
This is great. This is really interesting. And one thing that I looked at, because I'm on judicial nominating, is we looked at, there is a shortage of people that also apply to be judges. So this really dovetails really nicely with that. So one thing that I'm wondering, because some of the literature for recruiting, having people think about being a judge, was even doing outreach in middle schools and starting younger than high school. And I'm just wondering if that's something you explored at all in the research.
I can speak to that. So currently, the Vermont Bar Association has a lot of like outreach programs. So, they have a lot of educational programs. They go around to schools in Vermont. So that's high schools, maybe even middle schools. And that's generally one of the pieces of low-hanging fruit, because it may be the case that a lot of students aren't aware of resources like the lawful study program. So they might think that the cost is too high, so they're not even going to pursue that option. They might also feel that it's a risky option because, they have to go through so many years of education, and then, it's questionable if will they be able to establish a successful practice on their own. It's very difficult to establish a practice, especially in a rural area. And so connecting, existing practitioners, doing outreach, those are all sorts of solutions, even in middle schools and high schools, that can potentially have a big impact without being too expensive or without being too complicated to establish new things.
Sorry, Kat. So the other thing is I'm wondering about like alternative recruiting, like people who are thinking about changing careers, people who have been stay-at-home parents, people from out of state who are practicing. Like I've been at weddings out of state where people are like, oh, I work in Boston and the hours are so, I wish I could move to Vermont. And I'm like, well, actually, we need lawyers in Vermont. And so I'm just wondering about looking at people who have been in sort of the bigger corporate rat races and are seeking the advantages of what Vermont has to offer.
Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of the brief, that wasn't totally in the scope. I think it's a great point of trying to capture people who want to move to Vermont for other reasons that aren't just law. In the initial existing scholarship, the state Supreme Court report in October 2025, assembled by Alexander Arroyo, speaks on provisional licenses as a potentially fruitful means of attracting lawyers from out of state. To speak more to people in Vermont who are of a previous or who had previous employment, like you said, like they could have been a teacher for a long time or could have been a stay-at-home mom, for example. I think an attractive way of doing that would be the lawful study program as a way of not having to put so much cost up front through law school or even online or in person regardless. I think if we're going to talk about existing programs, the law study program is a way of attracting people who may not want to go through the entire legal education, right? That is a great question.
And for the people out of state, usually they're like, oh, we love the skiing. So I was like, well, what if like Jay, you're also going to get a year pass skiing Jay or skiing Mount Snow and going for the places that are in the rural areas. Like when you're talking about book groups or churches, like sort of looking at the demographic and
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, capitalizing on will that move into the state. That's also a very good.
I think thinking to like the rural practice clinic with Maine, they don't formally offer programs like that. But they're very easily could be if you have something located near skiway.
Right. Yes.
It's totally realistic to potentially provide those incentives. I think it's a very interesting idea, and Vermont is very nice in that way. We can offer incentives.
So fantastic job that you brought in front of us that we've been fighting for the 8 years that I've been here. Well, actually for a lot longer than that, because I am a native Vermonter, but we are rural and we're constantly trying to draw more people in. You're coming from the being the lawyer end of it, but we're trying to attract all kinds of different people and professionals in here and all this stuff. I come from the small business area of owning my own for 38 or 39 years. And it's like trying to get new people in here and to stay. Very difficult to do. As you know, the cost to live in Vermont is not inexpensive. And I won't get into the politics of that, but anyway, nice shot. Nice to meet you. I gotta go to work.
Nice to meet you. Thank you very much for your time.
So you mentioned internships. What kind of internships were you talking about within that? Details of what kind of internships are available to try to get folks to come to Vermont?
So the specifics in there aren't covered as much in our briefs. That was more of a mention. Thinking to what that could look like, it could be as simple as local practices make a job posting, and there's rather than it being a who do you know, who do you have a connection with, making it a more formal system of putting out internship opportunities and letting people come as they will with a priority to rural students or people who were once in state. In regards to specifics, I think that comes down to what attorneys want and need at the time. I don't know if I can comment on what those 100% look like.
I mean, well, if you think about when college students go looking for internships, the first places that they go on are LinkedIn, Handshake, all these very large online platforms. But these online platforms usually cater to these really large institutional recruiters like banks or these big law firms that have the resources to post on those. A lot of smaller practices in rural Vermont could use an intern or two, but they're not going to have the resources to post and advertise on these really large online platforms. So their reach is a lot smaller. So helping them out by connecting these firms with students that are looking for internships, that would be a great benefit to both the students and the small practices.
So did you have a chance to talk to the Defender General at all? Was that as far as the?
Well, we did not through this. He was someone we definitely wanted to target. Scheduling was difficult.
Yeah, I know.
Very good person that was on our radar into that.
The only reason because I've talked to him about this issue on numerous occasions, and from his perspective, well, there's lots of issues with this, and you've covered a lot of them. But one of the issues he mentioned is that's been critical for his being able to retain people that is brought here from out of state is housing availability. That they have. He's actually had attorneys that came here and couldn't find housing and then left the job, left the state, which is kind of interesting aspect of it's a little along the lines of what Ken said, but probably beyond the scope of couldn't resolve our housing crisis there
Next year.
So
If we had an answer, we'd tell you.
but that was yeah. So
I think if I is you do have some ideas about, the way that the stipend can work, for office space and housing.
Yeah, so of course, yeah, housing is a huge issue in Vermont. It's a really big issue for people looking to move. One of the ways that might help partially mitigate that issue is to tweak the incentive, like for example, the financial incentive to be more housing related. So for example, property tax credits, or for example, if lawyers want to set up shop but they can't find a storefront to rent, a lot of towns have, for example, a vacant room or two in their town hall. And they could provide that as a sort of incentive, to help them at least set up offices in, let's say, municipally owned properties, at least for a short period of time, so that the lawyers can save on rent and they don't have to think about finding housing for themselves and their families, as well as finding a space for their practice that might be really difficult at the same time. So that's one way that you can partially mitigate the housing shortage.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because actually, even from your research, it seems like the legislature isn't necessarily the actor of this. It's and from my view, it's kind of the courts and the bar more so, because the one thing that we could do but we can't is providing like money for scholarships and that. But our budget becoming so tight that that's additional funding. Particularly when I'm trying to say, we need to fund bringing more lawyers. It's a hard sell generally. So it's kind of interesting as far as it seems like the bar, I mean, and from those examples, it seemed like it was more of the bar and the courts than the legislature. Or was that different in one of those case studies?
Well, I think there's a lot of overlap. So in South Dakota's case, the president of the local state bar association in 2011, his law partner was actually a legislator. And so they were already connected through that. And so that's how initially the state bar and the legislators formed a rural interest group. And again, like all the rural practitioners will also be on the state bar. All the legislators that are attorneys will also be on the state bar. So the legislature is a good place to actually find a lot of those, people.
It's like more like informal rather than legislation.
Yeah, but it was in South Dakota, it was those very informal ties that help draw together all those disparate groups, because South Dakota is a very fiscally conservative state as well, and they have a lot of funding issues. They have very high rural poverty, so there's a lot of competing issues. And for them to find money to fund the stipend for over 13 years now took a lot of various diverse groups of people to help.
I think if I could just add to that, one of the things you talked about with the some of the consequences of the shortage are things that unfortunately make some of these things require a lot of investment, but also not doing them is not cost neutral, unfortunately,
Right.
in a lot of ways. So some of those costs that Noah mentioned earlier, in terms of how the state, I mean, I think there have been examples in other states of how those costs have actually come back on the other end with lawsuits.
It's very expensive for courts not to have lawyers and to have to hire them from front too.
No, you make a very good point. Yeah, and we have a huge percentage of pro se litigants. So
We also have a problem in general in Vermont in failing to recognize the benefit of an upfront investment. And just failing to account for how much more it's going to cost after the fact or whatever. And
Yes, it's especially difficult with this issue because it takes so long for a lawyer to get trained. You're not going to see immediate results for so long. So that's one of the reasons it's very hard to push for funding, because you're going to have long safe funding before you can start to see results.
yeah, it's like the problem with climate mitigation and, like housing and even like infrastructure stuff. Like people want immediate results in order to justify an investment, and politically that's like the more attractive option, but it's really short-sighted, and I feel like we run into that quite often. I'm just like walking in having not heard your conversation, but so I apologize for, maybe you covered this already, but it's frustrating that we have a habit of doing that. I think maybe it's human behavior, but it's quite evident in Vermont.
The solution to that, but I think, one of the things that has come out of these case studies is, finding partnerships with other things the state is interested in doing, so the program, that emanated out of also a medical, targeted medical professional shortages, common issues across such programs,
Thinking
and
of
also
educators too.
the consequences that, maybe the legislature is interested in reducing back, incentivize that as a different way of thinking about this issue.
Yeah, to kind of like riff, if you will, on Professor Pepper's point. I think Vermont and like UVM in particular does a very good job with undergraduate medical studying and services. Again, particularly at UVM, like they're exceptional in what they do medically. And if we think of Nebraska using rural medicine recruitment as a way of like emulating that towards law, I think Vermont already does, like, in my mind, a good job with that. I think that's another way we could latch on to really successful programs.
Yes, definitely. There's so much more attention given to rural health, rural educators than rural lawyers. It's just, there's a huge difference in terms of interest and attention devoted to those issues.
Well, thank you very much for the work. Now, this is very helpful and give us something to start off on, along with what the court task force is doing. And we'll be hearing from them at some point as well. But that'll be a next biennium thing since we're almost done this year.
They're going to report back, I think, in October.
Yes, yeah. So we can, if there are any things for legislature to do, we'll probably take them up then. But all right, so we're going to go off live.